In March of 1860, in the port city of Savannah, Georgia, a 17-year-old enslaved black girl named Abigail Foster was ordered to stitch a wedding dress so valuable that it was locked in a safe each night. The silk arrived from France. The lace cost more than 3 field hands combined. And the girl sewing it was not allowed to speak while she worked. By June, the bride would be dead. By September, 2 white men would disappear without explanation. And by winter, Abigail Foster would be sold south under a false name. Her hands permanently damaged, her talent erased from record. The white society of Savannah whispered that the dress was cursed. What they did not know was that every stitch Abigail placed into that gown carried a message, one sewn deliberately, patiently, and with full understanding of what it would cost her. By the time the truth surfaced decades later, the dress would be locked away in a private collection, its origin deliberately misattributed. What really happened inside that sewing room? What did Abigail Foster hide in plain sight, using needle and thread, that terrified the people who eventually discovered it? Before we uncover the disturbing truth behind the girl who sewed beauty while living in horror, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The sewing room sat behind the main house, detached but never forgotten, a long narrow structure of warped pine boards and shuttered windows that trapped heat the way a coffin trapped breath. In March of 1860, the air inside it was already thick enough to chew. Dust floated in the light like slow-falling ash. The smell of starch, sweat, and old fabric clung to the walls, soaked into the wood from decades of quiet labor. Abigail Foster bent over the table without lifting her eyes. Her fingers moved quickly, too quickly for someone who had learned to sew under threat instead of instruction. The needle flashed. In and out. Silk sighed every time the thread slid through it. Pale ivory fabric pooled across the table, glowing faintly in the light, so fine it seemed almost wrong to touch with hands that bore old scars. She did not speak. That rule had not been written anywhere, but it had been enforced enough times that no one needed to remind her. Silence was expected. Silence was safety. The door opened behind her. The sound alone was enough to tighten the muscles in her back. Hinges complained. Boots crossed the threshold. Abigail kept her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the stitch line she had measured by instinct alone. Mind your tension. The voice belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, mistress of the house, soon to be mother-in-law to Savannah's newest bride. Her words were calm, measured, the kind of voice that never needed to rise to be obeyed. "Yes, ma'am." Abigail's voice was barely there. A whisper shaped like submission. Mrs. Whitcomb moved closer. The silk rustled as she touched it with 2 fingers, as if afraid the fabric might stain her skin. She leaned over the table, studying the seam. "You pull too tight when you hurry. I will loosen it. You will do more than that." Mrs. Whitcomb straightened. "You will make it perfect." Abigail nodded once. Her eyes never left the dress. What Mrs. Whitcomb did not know, what no one in that house knew, was that Abigail's hands understood fabric the way other people understood language. She felt imbalance before she saw it. She sensed flaws the way a musician sensed a wrong note. The tension was not a mistake. It was deliberate, temporary. She would adjust it when the time came. Mrs. Whitcomb circled the table slowly, inspecting every inch. "Do you know how much this lace cost?" "No, ma'am." "More than your father would have fetched at auction." Abigail's needle paused for half a breath. Not long enough to be seen. Long enough to be felt. Mrs. Whitcomb smiled, satisfied by the silence that followed. "The silk came from France. Shipped across an ocean. Ruined if you spill blood on it." As if summoned by the words, the needle slipped. A sharp sting. A bead of red welled up on Abigail's finger. She sucked it away instantly, smearing the blood against the inside of her palm, pressing harder so nothing fell. Her breath did not change. Her face did not change. Mrs. Whitcomb watched closely. "You bleed too easily," she said. "That is a weakness." "Yes, ma'am." "You will ruin this gown if you are careless." Abigail resumed stitching. Faster now. Cleaner. The dress was unlike anything she had ever sewn. The bodice was structured in a way that demanded precision, the skirt layered and heavy, the lace hand-cut into patterns so intricate they looked alive. Roses, vines, small repeating symbols that meant nothing to the women who ordered them. But Abigail noticed. She always noticed. 3 weeks earlier, the fabric had arrived under guard. 2 men had carried the trunk inside and locked it themselves. Each night, Mrs. Whitcomb took the key back to the house. Each morning, she returned to watch. "You will not work on it alone," she had said. "Ever." Now she stood at the window checking the sky. Clouds were gathering low and heavy, promising rain. Finish the inner seams today, she said. The bride wishes to try it on by Sunday. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated at the door, then spoke again. Do you understand what this dress represents? Abigail did not answer immediately. I understand it is important, she said finally. Mrs. Whitcomb's mouth tightened. It represents position, continuity, order. Yes, ma'am. It represents a future. Abigail's needle slowed. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb left. The door shut. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Alone again, Abigail exhaled. Not relief. Calculation. She ran her fingers along the inside seam where no one ever looked. Where stitches were hidden. Where a mistake could be dismissed as handwork. She adjusted the tension. Just slightly. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Abigail stitched until the light shifted and shadows stretched across the floor. Her hands ached. Her eyes burned. Still she worked. Because what none of them knew, what they would not realize until it was far too late, was that this sewing room was not a place of obedience. It was a place of preparation. And every stitch Abigail Foster placed into that dress brought the future closer, thread by thread. Abigail Foster had been born in the early spring of 1843, during a week when the river swelled and the lowlands flooded so badly that the cabins smelled of rot for months afterward. She would never remember the water creeping under the door, or the way her mother screamed through labor while the rain beat against the roof like thrown gravel. But the body remembered things the mind forgot. She carried that season in her bones, a quiet endurance, a habit of waiting storms out. Her mother's name was Hannah. Hannah had sewn long before Abigail was born. She had sewn before she learned to read the weather, before she learned which men to avoid and which ones would not bother asking permission. Sewing had been the only thing that kept her inside the house and out of the fields. The only thing that made the mistress look at her hands instead of her body. By the time Abigail was 5, she could already thread a needle without looking. Do not pull, Hannah whispered one afternoon, guiding her daughter's small fingers. They sat on the cabin floor, scraps of old cloth spread between them. You let the cloth tell you what it wants. Abigail frowned, concentrating. Cloth does not talk. Hannah smiled then. A tired smile. Everything talks. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Those afternoons were stolen. They took place when the work was done and the light was fading, when no one was watching closely. Hannah would bring home torn shirts from the big house, ripped hems from dresses too old to matter. She taught Abigail how to hide a bad stitch, how to cut fabric so waste looked like intention, how to measure without numbers. By the time Abigail was 10, she could do the work of 2 women. That was the year Hannah was sold. There had been no warning. No final lesson. One morning she was there. That afternoon she was gone. Abigail stood by the road and watched a wagon roll away, dust swallowing the sound of her mother's voice. No one explained it. No one needed to. What Abigail learned that day was not grief. It was something colder. She learned that skill did not protect you. It only delayed things. After that, the sewing became hers alone. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed within weeks. She called Abigail into the house, stood her in front of a mirror taller than any door in the quarters. Stand straight. Abigail obeyed. Hands, Mrs. Whitcomb said. Abigail raised them. Mrs. Whitcomb turned them over slowly, inspecting calluses and scars the way a buyer inspected livestock. These are not field hands. No, ma'am. You learned from your mother. Yes, ma'am. She was adequate. Adequate. The word landed like a stone. You will work for me now, Mrs. Whitcomb said. In the sewing room. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not ruin fabric. You will not waste thread. Yes, ma'am. That was how Abigail became part of the house without ever belonging to it. The sewing room changed her days but not her nights. She still slept in the quarters. Still woke to the same bell. Still ate the same food. But now her hands touched silk instead of cotton, lace instead of burlap. She learned the difference between fabrics the way other children learned the difference between prayers. She also learned punishment. The first time Mrs. Whitcomb caught her adding a flourish, a curve where a straight seam would have sufficed. The slap came so fast Abigail barely saw it. Her head snapped sideways. The room went quiet. You do not decorate, Mrs. Whitcomb said. You execute. Yes, ma'am. The second time it was the needle. Mrs. Whitcomb took it from her fingers and pressed the point into Abigail's palm until blood bloomed. Not enough to cripple. Enough to remember. Beauty invites attention, she said calmly. Attention invites questions. Abigail nodded through clenched teeth. After that, she learned how to hide what she knew. She sewed plainly when watched. Perfectly but without personality. And when she worked alone, or thought she did, she practiced. Tiny stitches on scraps no one cared about. Patterns folded into hems that would never be seen. Symbols so small they vanished into the cloth unless you knew where to look. She did not yet know why she did this, only that it felt necessary. By 1860, Abigail had grown tall and narrow, her body shaped by labor and restraint. Her face was unremarkable by the standards of the house. Dark skin, steady eyes, hair kept wrapped and hidden. People forgot her easily, which was a kind of freedom. That spring, when the wedding order came, Mrs. Whitcomb summoned her without explanation. "The foster girl," she told the overseer. "Bring her." Abigail stood in the doorway as Mrs. Whitcomb spoke, her eyes fixed on the floor. "This dress will be spoken about," the woman said. "It will be remembered." "Yes, ma'am." "You will be careful." "Yes, ma'am." "You will understand that mistakes will not be tolerated." Abigail lifted her eyes then. Just for a moment. "I understand," she said. And she did. Because what Mrs. Whitcomb did not understand, what she could not imagine, was that Abigail Foster had been preparing for something long before the silk arrived. She had been preparing since the day her mother vanished down a dirt road. Since the day she learned that survival alone was not enough. And the sewing room, with all its rules and watching eyes, was finally giving her the materials she needed. Savannah in the spring of 1860 wore its beauty like a lie told often enough to sound true. The azaleas bloomed heavy and pink along wide streets, their petals falling into gutters already stained with mud and horse dung. Spanish moss hung from live oaks like funeral shrouds, softening the sharp lines of wealth and making decay look deliberate. From a distance, the city appeared orderly, profitable, God-fearing. Up close, it breathed differently. The port never slept. Cotton bales stacked along the riverfront like pale gravestones, each one stamped with marks that meant money to men who never touched the fields. Ships arrived heavy and left heavier. The air smelled of salt, tar, and sweat. Enslaved men moved in lines under shouted orders, their labor so constant it became part of the landscape, like tide and wind. Inside the city, the rules changed, but the outcome did not. House servants were displayed like fine furniture. Seamstresses, cooks, coachmen, useful people whose usefulness made them visible only when something went wrong. The rest faded into the background noise of the city, present but unacknowledged. Abigail Foster moved through Savannah as if she were part of that noise. On market days, Mrs. Whitcomb sent her with errands. Fetch thread from the mercer. Deliver mended gloves to a cousin's house. Carry parcels that marked her as property without anyone needing to say it aloud. Abigail walked with her head lowered, her pace steady. She listened. White women spoke freely around her, their words floating over her head as if she were deaf. "Did you hear about the Trowbridge girl's dress? French silk, they say. Real lace. I cannot imagine trusting an enslaved girl with such expense. They have no choice. No one else can sew like that." Abigail stored the voices away. Names, addresses, timetables. She learned which houses ordered new gowns every season and which reused old ones with clever alterations. She learned which men lingered too long at windows and which ones never noticed anything beyond their own reflection. She learned how the city worked. Weddings were the currency of Savannah society. Alliances stitched together with ceremony and spectacle. A bride's dress was not just clothing, it was a statement. A declaration of wealth, taste, and permanence. Women competed through fabric and silhouette the way men competed through land and numbers. Mrs. Whitcomb intended her son's marriage to be remembered. That was why the dress mattered. Abigail understood this instinctively. She saw how Mrs. Whitcomb's hands trembled slightly whenever she touched the silk, how she counted stitches as if counting money. She saw how visitors were ushered into the sewing room under the pretense of inspection, their eyes widening as they took in the fabric laid out like an altar offering. "Remarkable," one woman murmured. "It almost looks alive." Abigail did not look up. "It must be exhausting," another said lightly. "All that work for someone else's day." Abigail's needle did not slow. What none of them considered was that she heard everything, that she understood more than they assumed, that the quiet girl in the corner was mapping the city in her head, streets, houses, patterns of movement. She learned that the bride, Margaret Hale, was nervous, that she had delayed the fitting twice, that she argued with her mother behind closed doors. She learned that Mr. Hale drank more than was respectable and owed money to men who did not forgive easily. She learned that Mrs. Whitcomb had secrets of her own. The sewing room became a crossroads. People came and went. Gossip flowed in with the afternoon light and lingered in the dust. Abigail stitched and listened, her fingers moving in steady rhythm. 3 weeks into the work, Mrs. Whitcomb brought in a man Abigail had never seen before. He was tall, pale, with eyes that did not settle. He stood too close to the table, watching Abigail's hands instead of the dress. "This is Mr. Rollins," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "He is assisting with certain arrangements." Mr. Rollins smiled thinly. "You are very young." "Yes, sir." "Do you enjoy your work?" Abigail paused, then answered carefully. "I do what is asked." He nodded as if that pleased him. "Precision is important. A single flaw can unravel everything." "Yes, sir." He reached toward the fabric. Mrs. Whitcomb stopped him with a look. "She does not need interference," she said. Mr. Rollins stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. "Of course." But his eyes lingered on the inside seams, on the places most people ignored. Abigail felt the weight of that attention like a hand on her throat. That night, she lay awake in the quarters listening to the insects sing. She thought of her mother's hands, of the road, of the way Savannah hid its cruelty behind flowers and prayer. She knew something was moving toward her. Not fast. Not yet. But the city was tightening around the sewing room, drawing lines that would soon intersect. And Abigail Foster, who had learned to be invisible in plain sight, was standing at the center of it, needle poised, thread ready, whether anyone realized it or not. The dress began to change the room. At first it was subtle. The way people lingered longer than necessary. The way Mrs. Whitcomb's voice softened when she spoke about it, as if addressing something that could hear her. By the 4th week, the sewing room no longer felt like a workspace. It felt like a shrine. Abigail noticed because she noticed everything. The bodice lay open on the table now, its structure fully visible. Whalebone channels ran like ribs beneath the silk, each one placed with deliberate symmetry. The skirt had grown heavy with layers, fabric folded over fabric until the weight pulled at the table's edges. Lace panels waited nearby, pinned and labeled in Mrs. Whitcomb's precise handwriting. "Do not attach these yet," she said, tapping the lace with one finger. "The bride wishes to see the lines first." "Yes, ma'am." Abigail worked alone that afternoon, the rare permission given only because Mrs. Whitcomb had visitors. The door remained open, but no one stood watching. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching on floating dust. She turned the bodice inside out. That was where the dress spoke. Inside seams were meant to be crude, functional. No one saw them once the gown was finished. But this dress demanded balance even where it would never be admired. The structure was so carefully planned that a single altered stitch changed how the whole garment held itself. Abigail ran her fingers along the seam allowances. She felt the pressure points, the places where fabric pulled too hard, the places where it could be eased without consequence. She began to work. Not decoration. Adjustment. She loosened one channel by a fraction, tightened another, shifted weight so it redistributed across the bodice instead of settling at the center. These were not changes anyone would notice during a fitting, not unless they knew exactly what to look for, and no one ever looked inside. As she stitched, she remembered Hannah's voice. "Let the cloth tell you what it wants." This cloth wanted to hold, and it wanted to constrict. The door creaked. Abigail froze. But it was not Mrs. Whitcomb. The girl who stood in the doorway was white, pale as cream, her hair pinned too tightly at the temples. She held her gloves in one hand, twisting them without realizing it. "You must be Abigail," she said. Abigail stood. "Yes, miss." The girl stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I am Margaret Hale," the girl said finally. "The dress is mine." "Yes, miss." Margaret moved closer to the table, her eyes drawn to the silk. She reached out, then stopped herself. "My mother says I am not to touch it." Abigail waited. "They say you are very good," Margaret said, her voice low. "They say no one else could do this." Abigail kept her gaze lowered. "I do my best." Margaret laughed softly. "That is not what they say." Silence settled between them. Outside, a carriage rolled past, wheels rattling over stone. "Do you ever make mistakes?" Margaret asked. Abigail considered the question. "Yes, miss." "What happens when you do?" Abigail looked up then. Just enough to meet the girl's eyes. "I fix them," she said. Margaret swallowed. She circled the table slowly, studying the dress as if it were something alive. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Too beautiful." Abigail did not respond. "I am afraid," Margaret said suddenly. The words hung there uninvited. "Miss." "I know what I am supposed to say," Margaret cut in. "I know what everyone expects. But when I put this on," she gestured helplessly, It feels like a promise I cannot keep. Abigail's hands tightened around the fabric. Margaret lowered her voice. My father says marriage is security. My mother says it is duty. No one asks what it is to me. Abigail thought of her mother. Of promises that led only one way. I will make sure it fits you, she said carefully. Margaret smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. You are kind. Abigail did not correct her. Footsteps sounded outside. Margaret stepped back, composure snapping into place like a mask. Thank you, she said quickly, for listening. She left without waiting for an answer. Abigail returned to the table. Her heart beat harder than it had all afternoon. She resumed stitching, her movements slower now, more deliberate. She added a line of reinforcement beneath the boning, hidden, invisible, purposeful. What Margaret Hale did not know, what she could not imagine, was that the dress was no longer just hers. It was becoming something else. Something shaped not only by expectation and wealth, but by a girl who had learned how to make small changes matter. By evening, when Mrs. Whitcomb returned and inspected the work, she nodded once. Good, she said. Very good. Abigail lowered her eyes. The storm broke after dark. Rain hammered the roof. Thunder shook the walls. In the quarters, Abigail lay awake, listening. She thought of Margaret's hands hovering over the silk, of Mr. Rollins' eyes on the seams, of the way the dress seemed to watch her back when she turned away. None of them knew what was being built. Not yet. But the dress was nearly ready for its first fitting. And once it was worn, nothing would unfold the way they expected. The fitting took place on a Sunday afternoon, when the house was quieter and the city slowed itself in deference to God. Light filtered through lace curtains, pale and diffused, making the parlor look softer than it ever truly was. Mrs. Whitcomb had ordered every unnecessary servant out. Only those deemed essential remained. Abigail stood against the wall, hands folded, eyes lowered. The dress was lifted from the sewing room like a body being carried to burial. Mrs. Whitcomb and her sister handled it with ceremonial care, spreading the skirt across a chaise as if afraid it might bruise. Margaret Hale watched from the center of the room, her posture rigid, her face carefully arranged. Remove your dress, her mother said. Margaret hesitated. Only a second. Long enough to be noticed. Abigail felt it before she saw it, the tightening in the air, the shift in expectation. Now, Mrs. Hale added. Margaret complied. Layers fell away. Abigail kept her eyes down, focusing on the hem pooling near her feet. She had learned where it was safe to look. Bring it here, Mrs. Whitcomb said. Abigail stepped forward on silent feet. Together, they lifted the gown and guided Margaret into it. The silk slid over skin with a sound like breath. The bodice settled. The weight of the skirt followed. Abigail moved automatically, fastening hooks, aligning seams, her fingers finding their places without thought. She felt the structure engage, the way the dress began to hold Margaret's body, not just clothe it. Margaret inhaled sharply. Stand still, her mother said. I am, Margaret replied, though her voice wavered. Mrs. Whitcomb circled her slowly, inspecting. Extraordinary, she murmured. It fits as if it were grown, not sewn. Margaret swallowed. It is tight. It is meant to be, her mother said. Posture is everything. Abigail watched the way Margaret's shoulders drew back, how her ribs flared slightly as she adjusted her breathing. She noted the faint blanching of skin where the bodice pressed hardest. Can it be loosened? Margaret asked quietly. Mrs. Whitcomb turned. Why would it need to be? I just thought. No, her mother said flatly. It is perfect. Abigail waited. No one addressed her directly, but she felt their attention shift. Walk, Mrs. Whitcomb instructed. Margaret took a step, then another. The skirt moved beautifully, the layers responding exactly as intended. Applause murmured from the women gathered near the windows. Margaret's face remained pale. Turn. She did. Abigail noticed the way her hands clenched and unclenched, how she exhaled through her mouth instead of her nose. She noticed the slight tremor at the base of her throat. Breathe normally, Mrs. Hale said. I am trying, Margaret replied. Abigail stepped forward before she could stop herself. If the inner channel here is eased just a touch. Silence fell. Mrs. Whitcomb turned slowly. You were not asked. Abigail froze. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb studied her, eyes sharp. You have done your work. Do not presume beyond it. Abigail bowed her head. Margaret looked between them, something like fear flickering across her face. It is fine, she said quickly. Really? The fitting ended shortly after. The dress was removed, admired once more, then carried away. As the others left, Margaret lingered. "Abigail," she said softly. Abigail stopped but did not turn. "Will it feel like this all day?" Margaret asked. Abigail considered her answer carefully. "You will grow accustomed to it." Margaret closed her eyes. "That is not what I asked." Abigail turned then. Their eyes met. "It will not change unless it is changed," she said. Margaret nodded slowly as if filing the words away. "Thank you." She left the room alone. Later, in the sewing room, Mrs. Whitcomb stood over Abigail as she made notes. "You spoke out of turn," she said without looking up. "Yes, ma'am." "You will not do that again." "No, ma'am." Mrs. Whitcomb paused, then added, "The bride is sensitive. Do not encourage weakness." Abigail's needle moved. "Yes, ma'am." That night, long after the house had settled, Abigail returned to the dress. Only for a moment. Only to check. She ran her fingers along the seam she had adjusted earlier. She pressed gently, testing resistance. It held. She added another line of stitching, small and precise, reinforcing the structure just beneath the boning. Not enough to be noticed. Enough to matter. As she worked, she thought of Margaret's shallow breaths. Of the way the room had closed in around her. Abigail did not know what would happen next. Not exactly. She was not reckless enough to believe she controlled the future. But she understood pressure. She understood how small forces applied steadily could change outcomes. Outside, the city slept. The river rolled on, carrying cotton and secrets toward the sea. Inside the sewing room, Abigail Foster stitched with care, each movement deliberate. The dress was finished soon. And once it was worn again, it would begin to do what it had been shaped to do. What none of them realized, what they would only understand in hindsight, was that the first fitting had not been a test of beauty. It had been a warning. After the first fitting, the sewing room was no longer merely watched. It was guarded. Mrs. Whitcomb began arriving earlier, leaving later, her chair pulled close enough to the table that her skirts brushed the fabric when she leaned in. She brought ledgers and sat with a pencil poised, as if the dress might steal something if left alone. The door stayed open. The window stayed shut. Even the air felt monitored. Abigail adapted. She worked more slowly now. Not from fear. From precision. Every stitch was counted twice. Once for what it did and once for what it said. She learned the rhythm of Mrs. Whitcomb's attention. The moments when the woman's eyes drifted to the page, when conversation from the house crept in and pulled her focus away. Those were the moments Abigail used. Inside the hem she began a pattern. It was not obvious. It could not be. It took the form of spacing, 3 tight stitches, 1 loose, 2 tight, 1 loose. The repetition was subtle enough to pass for handwork, irregular enough to look unplanned. It was something Hannah had shown her once on a scrap of cloth, a thing learned without explanation. "Do not do it unless you must," Hannah had said then. "And if you do, make sure you could swear it means nothing." Abigail had not known what it meant at the time. She knew now. The pattern marked a path. A sequence. Not words exactly, but instruction. Where to look, where to pull, where pressure would give if applied the right way. It was not meant for the women who admired lace. It was meant for hands that understood labor. On Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Whitcomb sent Abigail into the city with a parcel. "Thread," she said. "The good kind. Do not dawdle." "Yes, ma'am." Abigail wrapped the bundle and stepped into the street. Savannah buzzed around her, carriages passing, merchants shouting, the smell of fish and river rot thick in the air. She walked the familiar route, her pace even, her eyes down. At the mercer's shop, she waited while the clerk fetched the order. A man stood near the door, leaning against the frame, his hat pushed back. "You work for the Whitcombs," he said casually. Abigail did not look up. "Yes, sir." "Dress for the Hale wedding," he went on. "Everyone's talking about it." "Yes, sir." He watched her hands as she accepted the parcel. "You do fine work." Abigail hesitated. Not long enough to draw attention. Long enough to choose. "Thank you," she said. He nodded toward the bundle. "May I?" She passed it to him without protest. He untied the string, fingers deft. Too deft. He lifted the edge of fabric wrapped inside, just enough to glimpse the hem. His thumb traced the stitching. Something flickered across his face. Surprise quickly masked. "You have a steady hand," he said lightly, rewrapping the parcel. "Be careful with that." "Yes, sir." He stepped aside to let her pass. As she left, he added quietly, "The river docks are loud at night." Abigail did not turn around. By the time she reached the sewing room again, her pulse had steadied. Mrs. Whitcomb barely glanced at the thread before returning to her ledger. "You are late," she said. "Yes, ma'am." That night, rain returned, soft and steady. In the quarters, Abigail lay awake listening to it strike the roof. She thought of the man's fingers on the hem, of the look in his eyes when he recognized something familiar. What he did not know, what she prayed he would never have to learn the hard way, was how dangerous recognition could be. The next day, Mr. Rollins appeared again. He stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sweeping the room. "Progress." "Nearly finished," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "The final lace goes on tomorrow." Mr. Rollins nodded. His eyes settled on Abigail. "May I observe?" Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated, then inclined her head. Briefly. Abigail's hands did not stop moving. She felt Rollins' attention like heat on her skin. He circled the table slowly, leaning in, peering at seams most men would never notice. "You work quietly," he said. "Yes, sir." "Too quietly," he replied. "People who are quiet are often thinking." Abigail did not respond. He reached toward the skirt. Mrs. Whitcomb opened her mouth. "Inside," Rollins said, already lifting the fabric. Abigail's heart stuttered. His fingers brushed the hem, followed the stitching, paused. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Rollins smiled. "Handwork," he said. "Irregular." As expected. He let the fabric fall. The moment passed. Mrs. Whitcomb exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. "You see? Nothing to concern yourself with." Rollins nodded, but his eyes lingered on Abigail as he turned away. After he left, Mrs. Whitcomb closed the door herself. "You will finish tomorrow," she said. "No more errands. No visitors." "Yes, ma'am." That night, Abigail returned to the dress one final time. She checked every seam, every hidden line. She adjusted nothing. It was already done. Outside, the city prepared for celebration. Inside the sewing room, a quiet girl finished a garment that carried more than silk and lace. It carried intent. And once it left her hands, there would be no taking it back. The wedding morning arrived wrapped in heat and noise, the kind of day Savannah specialized in, bright, humid, and already heavy with expectation before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Church bells rang from opposite ends of the city, their sounds overlapping in a way that made it difficult to tell which one called first. Carriages lined the street outside the Whitcomb house, wheels locked, drivers waiting, horses stamping impatiently. Inside, the house smelled of starch and flowers and perfume laid on too thick. Abigail was brought in before dawn. She stood in the sewing room as the final lace was unwrapped, her hands steady despite the ache that had settled into her wrists. Mrs. Whitcomb supervised the last inspection herself, running her fingers along the hem, nodding in approval at the way the light caught the fabric. "Immaculate," she said. "As it should be." Abigail said nothing. By mid-morning, the house filled with women, mothers, aunts, cousins, all speaking at once, their voices rising and falling like birds startled from trees. The bride was ushered into the dressing chamber, the door shut firmly behind her. Abigail was called inside last. Margaret Hale stood in the center of the room in her shift, pale and rigid, her hair already arranged beneath a veil. Her eyes met Abigail's in the mirror. "Just for a moment." "Put it on," her mother said. The dress was lifted again, heavier now than it had been in the sewing room. Abigail guided Margaret into it, her movements practiced, efficient. The bodice settled into place. Hooks closed. Seams aligned. Margaret inhaled and stopped. Abigail felt it immediately. The structure engaged faster than it had during the fitting, the reinforcement responding to posture, to tension. The dress held. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of the dressing table. "Breathe," her mother said sharply. "I am," Margaret replied, but her voice betrayed her. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped closer. "Stand straight." Margaret straightened. The bodice tightened. The pressure shifted upward, constricting in a way that forced her shoulders back and her chest high. It was not painful. Not yet. It was insistent. Abigail watched, her face composed. Her fingers hovered near the seams, ready to adjust if ordered. She was not ordered. "How do I look?" Margaret asked. Her mother circled her once, satisfaction clear. "Exactly as you should." Abigail saw the faint sheen of sweat at Margaret's temples. The way her breaths came shallow and quick. "No adjustments," Mrs. Whitcomb said before Abigail could speak. "We are already behind." They led Margaret out. The ceremony passed in a blur of sound and color. Sunlight filtered through stained glass. The minister's voice droned on about duty and obedience. Margaret stood still at the altar, her hands folded, her face composed with visible effort. Those close enough noticed her breathing. No one mentioned it. By the time vows were exchanged, Margaret's cheeks had flushed an unnatural shade of pink. Her chest rose and fell sharply beneath the bodice. Abigail stood at the back of the church with the other servants, watching. What none of them knew, what only Abigail could see, was how the dress responded to strain. How it adjusted itself subtly, redistributing pressure with each forced breath. The reception followed at the Whitcomb house. Music played. Glasses clinked. The bride was led through rooms, stopping to receive congratulations, to smile, to endure. "She looks faint," someone whispered. "It is nerves." Margaret's steps slowed. Her fingers trembled as she accepted a glass she did not drink from. Abigail felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She watched the line of the bodice, the way it held Margaret upright even as her body fought it. When Margaret stumbled, it was small, barely noticeable. But Abigail saw the moment the dress tightened again, compensating, forcing alignment. Mrs. Hale noticed then. "Margaret," she hissed. "Control yourself." "I need air," Margaret whispered. They guided her toward a side room. Abigail followed without being told. The door shut. The noise faded. Margaret leaned against the wall, her breaths ragged now. "It is too tight," she said, panic breaking through. "It will not let me." Mrs. Whitcomb reached for the laces. "Nonsense." She tugged. The bodice resisted. Abigail stepped forward. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Whitcomb pulled harder. The fabric held. The reinforcement did exactly what it had been shaped to do. Margaret gasped. "Stop," she said. "Please." Mrs. Hale's face drained of color. "What is wrong with it?" Abigail's hands moved without instruction. She knew where to pull, where to ease. She slid a finger beneath the seam, pressing in just the right place. The dress loosened. Only slightly. Enough for Margaret to inhale fully. She sagged against the wall, relief flooding her face. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at the seam, then at Abigail. "What did you do?" Abigail lowered her eyes. "I adjusted it." Mrs. Whitcomb's voice sharpened. "You were told no adjustments." Margaret clutched Abigail's sleeve. "Do not send her away," she said breathlessly. "Please." For a moment no one spoke. Then Mrs. Whitcomb straightened. "Fine," she said. "But this ends now. The dress will not be touched again." "Yes, ma'am." They returned Margaret to the reception. The worst had passed, or so it seemed. By evening, the celebration was winding down. Guests departed. The bride was escorted upstairs. Abigail returned to the sewing room alone. She sat on the stool and waited. It was well past midnight when the scream cut through the house. Short, sharp, then silence. What happened next would be explained away as a sudden illness, a weak heart, a tragic coincidence. But Abigail, sitting in the dark sewing room, already knew the truth. The dress had done exactly what it had been made to do. And by morning, nothing in the Whitcomb house would ever be the same. By dawn, the Whitcomb house had been scrubbed of panic. Windows were opened. Sheets were changed. Water was carried up the stairs and back down again, tinged faintly with something pink no one spoke about. By the time the doctor arrived, summoned with urgency but greeted with calm, the household had already agreed on its story. "Her heart," Mrs. Hale said, seated stiffly in the parlor, her eyes red but dry. "She was always delicate." The doctor nodded as if he had expected nothing else. He did not ask to see the body for long. He did not ask about the dress at all. He listened to the breathing of a young woman who no longer breathed and pronounced the words everyone needed. A tragedy. Sudden. Unavoidable. By mid-morning, the bells rang again. Slower this time. Abigail was not called upstairs. She remained in the sewing room, hands folded in her lap, listening to the muffled sounds of grief carried through walls thick enough to hide it. She knew how these things worked. There would be no questions asked of her. Not publicly. Not yet. That came later. Mr. Rollins arrived before noon. He did not knock. He stepped into the sewing room and closed the door behind him, his movements careful, controlled. He did not sit. "You were present last night?" he said. "Yes, sir." "You adjusted the gown?" "Yes, sir." Without instruction. Abigail met his eyes. "I was instructed to help the bride breathe." Rollins studied her for a long moment. "Did you know the adjustment would not hold?" Abigail shook her head once. "No, sir." That was true enough. She had not known how quickly it would happen. Only that it would. Rollins walked to the table, lifting the edge of the skirt. He ran his fingers along the inside seam again, slower this time, more deliberate. "This is fine work," he said quietly. "Too fine for chance." Abigail said nothing. "You understand why I am here?" "Yes, sir." "You understand what people will think if they begin to ask the wrong questions?" "Yes, sir." Rollins nodded. "Good. Then you also understand what must be done." He straightened. "The dress will be removed from this house. It will not be altered. It will not be discussed. And you," he paused, "you will be sold." The word settled into the room like dust. "Yes, sir," Abigail said. Rollins watched her closely as if waiting for something else. Tears, fear, rage. None came. "You do not seem surprised." "I have been preparing," she replied. Rollins' mouth twitched. "For what?" "For being moved." He studied her a moment longer, then turned away. "It will happen quickly. Before anyone connects you to last night." "Yes, sir." That afternoon, Mrs. Whitcomb came to the sewing room for the last time. She stood in the doorway, not entering. She did not look at the dress. "You have served your purpose," she said. "You will be transferred south. A rice plantation near the coast." "Yes, ma'am." "You will not speak of what you saw here." "No, ma'am." Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated. For just a fraction of a second, something like uncertainty crossed her face. "It was not your fault," she said finally. Abigail did not respond. That night she packed nothing. There was nothing to pack. Before dawn, she was taken from the quarters and placed in a wagon with 2 others bound for the coast. No ceremony. No farewell. Savannah slipped away behind her, its beauty intact, its secrets preserved. As the wagon rolled, Abigail flexed her fingers slowly. Pain flared along her palms. Sure. Immediate. She looked down. Her hands were wrapped in cloth. Fresh. Too fresh. "What happened?" she asked the woman beside her. "Overseer said you worked too much," the woman whispered. "Said you needed reminding." Abigail understood. They had crushed her hands deliberately. Not enough to maim completely. Enough to end what she could do best. She closed her eyes. What Rollins did not know, what Mrs. Whitcomb would never admit to herself, was that the work was already finished. The dress was gone. The message sewn into it was beyond her reach now. But the knowledge remained. And knowledge, once learned, did not require hands. Weeks later, in a quiet warehouse near the river, a dock worker folded the wedding gown carefully, his fingers brushing the hem. He paused, frowning slightly. He followed the stitching. Once, twice. His breath caught. He did not speak of it. Not yet. History would record Margaret Hale's death as a misfortune. A weak constitution. A sad beginning to a promising alliance. Abigail Foster's name would vanish from the books entirely. But pressure leaves marks. And even when people try to smooth them out, the fabric remembers. The rice plantation lay low and wet, a stretch of land that smelled perpetually of rot and standing water. By the time Abigail arrived, summer had settled into the marshes, thick and unrelenting. The work there was different from Savannah. Slower in motion, harsher in consequence. The fields demanded bodies, not skill. And hands were expected to be replaceable. Abigail learned quickly how to hold herself. She kept her fingers wrapped when she could. She favored her wrists over her palms. She let others assume weakness. The overseer noticed, of course. They always did. "City girl," he muttered the first week, watching her struggle to grip a pole. "Soft." She did not correct him. At night, in the quarters, the pain returned in waves. Her hands throbbed with a deep, dull ache that made sleep difficult. She pressed them beneath her thighs and counted breaths until dawn. What she did not know, what she could not know yet, was that the dress had begun its own journey. It left Savannah quietly, boxed and labeled, its provenance rewritten in careful ink. It traveled by cart and then by boat, packed among bolts of cloth and crates of goods, handled by men who never thought to question what they carried. It arrived north weeks later, sold to a private collector who prized rarity and story in equal measure. He did not know its true story, but others did. The dock worker who had first noticed the stitching, his name was Isaac, said nothing at first. He waited. He watched. He followed the trail of the gown the way one followed a rumor, quietly, patiently. When he finally spoke, it was not to white ears. "It is a map," he said one night, unfolding a scrap of cloth in the lamplight. "Not of places, of forces." They studied it together, men and women who understood labor, who understood how pressure could be applied without leaving obvious marks. They traced the sequence with calloused fingers. They argued over meaning. They tested the pattern on old garments, on discarded stays. The conclusions unsettled them. It was meant to hold, one woman said, to force shape where there is none. And to fail, Isaac replied. At the worst time. They did not know Abigail Foster's name. Only that someone had known enough to hide instruction where no one thought to look. On the rice plantation, Abigail fell into routine. She learned the tides, the way water moved through the fields, the way overseers looked away when storms came in hard. She learned who traded information for favors and who did not trade at all. Her hands healed slowly, not completely. She adapted the way she always had. One evening, as the sun sank red over the marsh, a woman sat beside her. "You were a seamstress," the woman said. It was not a question. Abigail kept her eyes on the water. "I sewed." The woman nodded. "They say a dress killed a bride in Savannah." Abigail's breath caught just once. "They say it was cursed," the woman continued. "They say the girl who made it vanished." Abigail said nothing. The woman leaned closer. "They say it is still out there." Abigail turned then. "Who says this?" "Men who listen," the woman replied. "Men who carry things." Abigail looked back at the marsh. The insects hummed. The water moved as it always did. "Stories change," she said. "Yes," the woman agreed. "But stitches do not." Weeks passed. Then months. In Savannah, the Whitcomb house returned to order. Mrs. Whitcomb hosted dinners again. The sewing room was cleared. New girls came and went. The dress was not mentioned. Mr. Rollins moved on to other arrangements. He did not know that the pattern had already been copied, that the instruction had been memorized, shared, tested. He did not know that a thing designed for one body could be understood as a principle, not a singular act. By winter, rumors began to surface, quiet ones, of garments that fit too well, of stays that held too long, of women who collapsed suddenly at moments that could not be explained. Nothing that could be proven, nothing that could be traced. Abigail heard none of this directly. But sometimes at night, when the pain in her hands flared, she thought of the sewing room, of the silk under her fingers, of the way the dress had responded exactly as she knew it would. She did not feel triumph. She felt completion. Because what none of them understood, not Rollins, not Mrs. Whitcomb, not the men who rewrote records, was that control was never absolute. It relied on belief, on repetition, on the assumption that the rules could not be learned from the inside. Abigail Foster had learned them. And once learned, they could be used by anyone willing to listen. The marsh breathed around her, patient and enduring. The future, already altered in ways no ledger could record, waited. By the time winter loosened its grip on the coast, a man arrived at the rice plantation with a ledger and a smile that did not reach his eyes. His name was Thomas Avery, and he wore his curiosity the way some men wore cologne, liberally and without concern for who noticed. He claimed to be a factor, interested in yields, efficiency, labor arrangements. He asked questions that sounded reasonable and watched answers like they were cards being laid face up. Abigail noticed him immediately. He stood apart from the overseer, observing rather than commanding. He noticed hands. He noticed posture. When he looked at her, he did not look away quickly. "You," he said one afternoon, pointing. "You were in Savannah." It was not a question. Abigail kept her eyes on the mud at her feet. "I was sold from there." Avery smiled. "I thought so. You move like someone who has worked indoors." Silence stretched. The marsh insects filled it easily. "They say a dress caused quite a stir there last year," he continued lightly. "Strange thing. Perfectly healthy girl then." He snapped his fingers. "Gone." Abigail did not respond. Avery crouched slightly, lowering himself into her line of sight without touching her. "People say many things. I prefer facts." She lifted her gaze then, slow and deliberate. "Facts are written by people with pens." Avery laughed softly. "That is very nearly clever." He straightened, brushing mud from his trousers. "I would like to speak with you again. Privately." The overseer bristled. "She is field labor now." "Yes," Avery said, unbothered. "And still human." The overseer snorted but said nothing. That night, Abigail did not sleep. She had learned long ago that curiosity was more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty announced itself. Curiosity crept. The next afternoon, Avery returned with a bottle of cheap whiskey and an air of confidence. "I am not here to threaten you," he said, settling onto a crate near the quarters. "I am here to understand." Abigail sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the familiar ache begin, slow and deep. "You made something," Avery said. "Something clever." "I sewed a dress." "You encoded instruction into it." Abigail's expression did not change. I have seen the pattern, Avery continued. Not the original. A copy. Someone showed me. He leaned forward. You knew exactly what you were doing. Abigail waited. Avery sighed. You understand leverage, pressure, design. These are useful skills. For what? She asked. For influence, he replied. For shaping outcomes without leaving fingerprints. Abigail studied him. She saw ambition, hunger. A man who believed himself smarter than the system because he could name its parts. What do you want? She asked. Avery smiled. To know if there is more. There is always more, Abigail said. He leaned closer. Then tell me. She stood abruptly. The movement sent pain flaring through her palms. She welcomed it. Pain anchored her. No, she said. Avery blinked. Excuse me? You think because you noticed you own it? Abigail went on, her voice steady. You think knowing a thing makes you safe. Avery's smile thinned. Be careful. Careful is what made it work, she replied. The air between them tightened. Avery rose slowly. You could have been useful. Abigail met his gaze. You already are. He frowned. How so? You will talk, she said. Men like you always do. Avery stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. You are remarkable. He left shortly after, his interest apparently satisfied. 3 days later, he was found face down in a drainage channel near the fields. The official explanation was drink. Slippery footing. An unfortunate accident. No one mentioned the garment found folded neatly in his quarters. No one asked why the stays inside it bore marks that did not match his body. Abigail heard the news at dusk. She felt no shock, only a quiet settling. She knew then that the thing she had started no longer belonged to her alone, that others had learned enough to apply it without her hand. That was both comfort and danger. That night, as the marsh wind moved through the reeds, Abigail pressed her aching hands into the cool earth and breathed. The world had noticed, and once noticed, it would not stop asking. The question now was not whether the pattern would spread. It was who would survive it. Thomas Avery's death settled over the plantation like fog, thick at first, then thinning into something people pretended not to notice. The overseer drank more heavily for a week. The factor's ledger disappeared. A rumor circulated that he had been skimming. Another claimed he had insulted the wrong man. Explanations piled up the way excuses always did, until the truth was buried beneath their weight. Abigail was not questioned. That, more than anything, told her how thoroughly the system protected itself. Men like Avery were anomalies only when they disrupted order. Once removed, the machine smoothed the edges and moved on. But something had changed. The quarters were quieter at night. Not with fear. Fear had always been there, but with attention. People listened now. They spoke in half-phrases. They watched the hands of those who worked with cloth, the posture of those who dressed the house. A woman named Ruth brought Abigail a shirt with a torn seam. Can you look at this? She asked, her voice casual. Abigail took it, ran her fingers along the rip. The fabric was coarse, forgiving. Yes, she said. Ruth leaned closer. I heard there are ways to make things hold. Abigail looked up slowly. Things already hold, she said. That is the problem. Ruth nodded, accepting the answer she was given, not the one she wanted. That was how it worked. You did not teach unless asked properly. You did not show unless you were certain. Weeks passed. By late winter, Abigail's hands had changed. The swelling had gone down, but stiffness remained, especially in the mornings. She learned to work through it, to use her wrists and forearms, to rest when others would push. She did not try to sew as she once had. She did not need to. She watched instead. She learned which men boasted and which listened, which women noticed fit and which dismissed discomfort as vanity. She learned how fear traveled faster than proof, how suggestion lingered longer than explanation. In Savannah, the wedding gown surfaced again. It appeared in a private viewing, displayed on a form too narrow to suggest the body it had once held. The collector spoke of craftsmanship, of rarity, of the unknown artisan whose hand had been lost to time. Guests admired the lace. They remarked on the unusual interior structure, the way the garment seemed to impose shape even on empty air. No one makes them like this anymore, the collector said proudly. Someone asked about the bride. A tragedy, he replied lightly. Unrelated. He did not notice the man at the back of the room, silent, watching the hem. He did not see the recognition pass across his face. The man left early. He said nothing. He did not need to. By spring, the pattern had been shared enough times that it no longer belonged to any one person. It had become principle, understanding, a thing you could adapt. Not every attempt worked. Some garments failed. Some wearers sensed danger and stopped before it mattered. A few makers were caught, punished quietly, their work destroyed. But enough succeeded to change behavior. Women loosened their stays sooner. Men watched fittings with unease. Doctors began recommending moderation in fashion, citing recent incidents without specifics. Control, once invisible, had become conspicuous. Abigail heard fragments through the quarters, through passing hands and whispered exchanges. They say a woman fainted at a ball in Charleston. They say the dress would not give. They say someone knew how to make it that way. Abigail said nothing. She had never believed in perfect outcomes. Only in pressure applied long enough to alter direction. One evening, as the sun bled into the marsh, Ruth returned. "They are moving people again," she said quietly. "Selling south." Abigail nodded. "They always do. Not like this." Ruth hesitated. "They are looking for makers." Abigail closed her eyes briefly. She had known this moment would come. "You should stop," Ruth said. "Whatever it is you are part of. It is drawing eyes." Abigail opened her eyes. "It was always drawing eyes." Ruth swallowed. "Then what do we do?" Abigail considered the question. She thought of Hannah's hands guiding hers, of the sewing room, of Margaret's breath catching beneath silk, of Avery's curiosity satisfied too late. "We learn to listen better," she said, "and to leave less behind." That night, Abigail burned a small scrap of cloth in the cook fire. The pattern vanished in flame. The knowledge did not. By summer she was sold again. Farther inland this time. New name. New ledger entry. The transfer papers listed her as unskilled. She watched the coast recede, the marsh giving way to drier land. She felt no panic, only a steady resolve. What they did not know, what they would never fully understand, was that erasure did not undo influence. That removing a name from a book did not remove the thing that name had set in motion. Abigail Foster disappeared into the interior, just another body in a system built to forget. But the system had learned something it could not unlearn. That pressure, applied from within, left marks no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. And even when the hands that first stitched the lesson were broken, the lesson itself remained, passed on in glances, in caution, in the quiet recognition that some shapes were not as fixed as they seemed. The world did not change overnight, but it shifted. And once shifted, it would never settle quite the same way again. Years later, long after the war had torn the old order apart and rebuilt it in quieter, crueler forms, someone would find the record. It was not hidden with intention. It sat misfiled in a Charleston archive, wedged between shipping manifests and insurance claims, its ink faded, its margins crowded with corrections made by men who never imagined their handwriting would matter. The entry was brief. Wedding gown. Origin unknown. Artisan, Negro girl. Savannah, 1860. No name. No note of sale. No mention of death. Just enough truth to be dangerous. The historian who found it did not recognize its weight at first. He copied the line, moved on, forgot it for months. Only later, after hearing a story from an elderly woman whose grandmother had worked as a maid, did the pieces begin to align. She said there was a dress, the woman told him. One that held too tight. One that made people afraid of what they could not see. The historian asked questions then. Careful ones. He traced ownership. Private collections. Quiet sales. He found references to unusual construction, to garments that behaved as if they remembered bodies long gone. He never found Abigail Foster's name again. But absence too could speak. On the inland plantation where Abigail spent her later years, she lived quietly. She worked when needed. She taught when asked, never directly, never all at once. Her hands stiffened with age, the damage never fully receding, but she adapted as she always had. When girls came to her with torn dresses or loose seams, she fixed them plainly. When women came with questions they did not know how to phrase, she answered only what was safe to answer. "Listen to the cloth," she would say. "It will tell you when something is wrong." Some understood more than others. She never married. Never left a record of children. When she died, sometime in the early 1880s by best estimate, there was no marker, no ceremony. Just another body laid into ground already crowded with forgotten names. And yet, the habits she taught survived her. The caution did. The attention to fit. The understanding that design was never neutral. Even after corsets loosened and fashions changed, the lesson endured in subtler ways. In how people questioned what was presented as beautiful. In how some structures, once seen clearly, could never again be mistaken for comfort. The dress itself vanished sometime after the turn of the century. Sold, lost, possibly destroyed, possibly still folded in some dark trunk. It seems intact, its message waiting for hands that knew how to read it. Historians would later debate whether the stories were exaggerated, whether coincidence had been mistaken for intent, whether a single girl could truly have altered anything at all. They would argue over documentation, over plausibility, over motive. What they could not argue with was impact, because after 1860 something changed. Women spoke more openly of discomfort. Doctors wrote warnings where they had once written prescriptions. Fashion slowly, grudgingly shifted toward breath and movement instead of pure restraint. No one credited an enslaved black girl from Savannah, but change rarely carried the names of those who forced it. Abigail Foster had never believed she would be remembered. She had not sewn for legacy or revenge or glory. She had sewn because she understood pressure, how it worked, how it could be redirected, how even the smallest adjustment could alter an outcome if applied at the right moment. She had sewn because it was the only language the world allowed her to speak. And the world, whether it admitted it or not, had listened. What do you think this story was really about? Was Abigail a quiet revolutionary, or simply a survivor who used the tools she was given? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories buried on purpose, voices erased by design, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share this video with someone who believes history is only what was written down. These stories need to be remembered. These voices need to be heard. See you in the next one.